Welcome friends, it's me, Aaron the artist. One of the things that trips up a lot of beginner artists is drawing characters in different poses. Most of us start learning to draw struggling with that dull pose where the character is just sort of staring emptily at the viewer. But I'm going to go over 5 tips that you can use when drawing just about any pose. The first thing to say is that if you're drawing complex or dynamic poses, you should use references. Very few of us have a perfect memory of human anatomy, and most of us can't remember how all of the muscles and proportions look in interesting poses, especially when you introduce tricky camera angles. So, you should find yourself a reference image that's as close to the pose as you want as possible. If you're not sure where to get references from, I usually just use Pinterest. If you know the specific pose that you want, you can type it directly into the search. Or if you're just looking for ideas, you can type pose references and just see what comes up. When I'm practicing poses, I'll often search for yoga poses or martial arts or something like that. There are other things you can do to get reference too, like you could use a 3D model from an app like Magic Poser or something like that. If you're smart enough, you can pose these models in any way that you want, and there are also some pre-made poses you can use as well. I'm not smart enough to do it, and when I try it, I end up making these creepy, broken action figures. I do follow a few photographers and pose models that have really interesting pose material. People like those you see on screen right now. You could take pictures of yourself in the pose that you want as well, but honestly, I don't do that. Once you've got a good reference, hold on just a sec. Don't start drawing yet. We can still make this way easier for ourselves. Open the reference in your drawing app, lower the opacity right down, and then trace the basic shapes of the pose on a new layer. I tend to look for the ribcage, the pelvis, and the head. Maybe add a few cylinders for the limbs. Now you'll have a simplified version of your reference photo, without all of the clothes or other distracting details. Then you can use your tracing as a reference to draw from. It's much easier to draw working from the simplified shapes version than from that much more complex looking photo reference. Now you can focus on drawing just some easy cylinders and spheres without getting confused by clothing or anatomy. You can always bring the photo back up if you need it, of course. Now, it's very tempting when you use this technique to skip the drawing step altogether. You might want to just trace the shapes over the photo, and then use your tracing as a base to add clothes, details, and finish your character. Why bother drawing then when you can just cheat? And you know what, you can absolutely do that, and some artists use 3D models in exactly that way. Nothing wrong with it. I don't do it though, for 2 reasons. The first is, I just like drawing, and I enjoy the challenge of drawing it freehand. But second, and more important for a lot of folks, if you depend on being able to trace your reference, that means you're limited to the anatomy and proportions of the model in the reference. And if you want to do exaggerated proportions or more cartoonish poses, you won't be able to do that by relying on tracing. You'll need to be able to draw the pose by observing the reference and making any stylistic changes that you want. You don't want your characters to be limited only to whatever your model happens to look like. When it comes to getting started with the drawing, one thing to get you started is looking for the angle of the hips and shoulders. A lot of dynamic poses have the two pointing in different directions, but it isn't always the case. When you've got the 2 angles in place though, you can use them as a starting point to draw the 2 main masses of the body, the ribcage and the hips. We're going to ignore all of the other parts of the body for now, and just get in the ribcage, the hips, and the head. Getting those 3 in the right places compared with one another is the most difficult part of any pose, and it gets way easier after that. I will often use this big pair of pants to indicate the hips, and then whatever this shape is for the ribcage. When you're drawing from a reference, the most useful thing I ever learned when it comes to making accurate drawings is how to measure angles with your pencil. I really can't overstate how much my drawings improved once I started doing this. Suppose that I want to know what angle to draw this leg. All I need to do is place my pencil over the reference like this, line it up so that it's at the same angle as the leg, and then move my pencil back across to my drawing space. It can be a bit difficult at first to keep your hand steady enough to carefully steal the angle, but it gets way easier with practice, and eventually you might be able to observe those angles just with your eyes without using the pencil. I like to use the pencil measuring whenever I'm struggling though. When it comes to attaching the limbs to the body, I used to struggle a lot with getting the hands to sit in the right place while having the arms be the right length. A very easy solution is just to draw the hands first, kind of like Rayman. Draw the hand where it needs to be, then try to locate the elbow joint, and then simply connect up the dots. You can do the same thing with the legs too if you want. Draw the foot first, then the knee, then connect up with your cylinders. Alright, finally, once you've got a basic sketch of the pose down, don't be surprised if it doesn't look right straight away. Unless you're incredibly skilled, your first attempt is probably going to be off in a few ways. Don't worry about that. Here's a way you can check that things are in the right places. Take a look at your reference photo again. Now have a look for any shapes in between the gaps created by the figure. These are called negative spaces. Take a look at the negative spaces in your drawing. If you've got an accurate drawing, the negative spaces are all going to look similar. If one of your negative shapes is too big or too small, you can erase and adjust until it's the right size. Looking at the negative space instead of the figure gives you a new perspective on the drawing. Sometimes, when you've been drawing something for a long time, you can start to overlook mistakes that you've made, or the mistakes are kind of invisible somehow. But if you start looking at the negative shapes instead of the figure, suddenly it's like you're looking at a completely different image, and it's much easier to spot mistakes. One thing I haven't mentioned in this video is drawing using the stick figure. A lot of artists swear by starting their poses by doing one of these loose stick figures to map out the gesture. If you've ever had an art book with figure drawing lessons in it, I'd bet money on it teaching something about stick figures. Honestly, I hate stick figures. I've always found that they make my proportions worse and not better. I kind of see how it could be useful to map out the overall structure of the pose before adding any detail. So, if you like stick figures, ignore me. What do I know? Go draw your stick figures. But they're just not for me. These are all the things I think about whenever I draw poses, and if you keep them in mind, hopefully your figure drawings will be much better. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video or it helped you out, do all those things for me, and have a nice day.